Thank you to Pastor Josh and all of you for letting me fill in here today. This morning I would like to focus on what I have called ordinary, extraordinary people. Regular, ordinary folks that when they trusted God were able to do extraordinary things in His name. We're going to talk about an Old Testament patriarch, a founding father, and some folks closer to home. And then, finally, we're going to talk briefly about all of that ties into the bat that I discovered on the floor next to my desk on Monday. Not the baseball kind of bat, either. The flying, creepy, rabies-carrying type of bat. Okay? So I understand that all of my little tangents don't make sense to everybody, but I promise I'm going to wrap this all up in about 20 minutes. And you're all going to go, Okay? All right. So if you've probably figured out from our scripture reading, our first ordinary, extraordinary person this morning is Isaac. Some scholars have suggested that the reason that the story of Isaac is in the Bible is to show us how our God can use an ordinary person with no abilities. And I think that's a little harsh. I've always felt a little sorry for Isaac. Can't have been easy to be Isaac. I don't think it was very easy for him to compete with his father. Or for that matter, with his son. Or even his grandson. Isaac is often called the father of all nations because he is considered to be a patriarch for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Each of those religions trace their spiritual lineage back to Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, a promise that he fulfilled both literally through his descendants and spiritually through the inclusion of all believers. So imagine you're Isaac. It's your first day of school. Or something similar. So Isaac, what does your dad do? Well, he's the father of all nations. And you? No, I'm not the father of all nations. And how many times do you think he had to hear the story of how his father nearly killed him as a child as an offering to God? And I don't care how it ended or what the circumstances were, but that has to mess with you a little bit. Isaac was the ordinary son of an extraordinary father. And he became the ordinary father of an extraordinary son, Jacob. And although he lived longer than Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph, Isaac's life is pretty much covered in that one chapter in Genesis. And most of the exciting highlights there are that he fights with his neighbors over some wells. And at the end, when they're talking about Jacob's life, we realize that he got tricked by his wife and his child. That's pretty much it. Ordinary and kind of blah. He wasn't bold like his father, wasn't shrewd like his son Jacob, wasn't a gifted leader like his grandson Joseph. And yet God used him to work out his covenant promises. Isaac shows us that there is hope in the Lord for all of us ordinary people. God blessed Isaac in spite of his slowness and his sin because of the relationship and the covenant that God had with Abraham. Abraham's descendants would be blessed because of their relationship to him, but like Isaac, they had to grow in faith and obedience. Jesus promised us that he will build his church. And in spite of our slowness and sin, God will bless us and use us to fulfill his purpose because of our relationship to the Father through the Son. But we need to grow in faith and obedience too, just like Isaac. We discovered that Isaac was an ordinary person with ordinary trials. Verse 1 tells us that there was a famine in the land. And what's interesting about this is that there was a famine in the land. And there's famines all over the Old Testament, but there was a famine in the land. And what land are we talking about? The Promised Land. The land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants. The land that Caleb came back and said was flowing with milk and honey. There was a famine there. And God could have taken care of Isaac and provided him with food and water during the famine. But he didn't. God's chosen man had to suffer right along with his Canaanite neighbors. Trials are the normal experiences of God's people, even when they are right where he calls them to be. Isaac also had ordinary fears. What do people do when things start to go badly? They panic. And what did Isaac do? He panicked. The scripture doesn't say there was a famine in the land, so Isaac turned to his Lord. Nope. What he did was he went to the king of the Philistines to beg for food. And from there, he was planning on going to Egypt before God stopped him at Gerar. In verse 24, the Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not fear, for I am with you." God never says, "Do not fear" to somebody that's not afraid. Isaac had many fears. Isaac was an ordinary man with ordinary sins, but that didn't make him unusable to God. In fact, the only people that God uses are ordinary sinners. Sometimes Satan gets in our head and he gets us to thinking that we are such a mixed bag of good and evil and God can't possibly use me. But thank God that he does use us when we're growing, when we're maturing, before we get to perfection, because we're never going to get to perfection. The point is not that we should tolerate being sinful people, but rather we can't think that God can't use us because we struggle with sin. The ordinary people that God uses are ordinary sinners, just like you and me, but we are sinners that are working at obeying God. Isaac was an ordinary person with ordinary hassles. Do you understand when we were reading through all of that, the repeated hassles that he had with his neighboring people over the wells? Abraham dug wells, the Philistines plugged them up with dirt. So Isaac dug them out again and dug new wells of his own. But then his neighbors decided that those wells belonged to them. If we were to plot this out on a map, we would notice that, remember, Isaac had run away from the Promised Land, and now he's in this place called Gerar. I'm not entirely sure where that's at. It's in the desert somewhere between the Promised Land and Egypt. But every time he had one of these spats with his neighbors, one of these little hassles, he had to leave. He moved to get away from them. And if we plotted it out on a map, every time he moved, he got closer and closer and closer to the Promised Land. And finally, he was so close to Beersheba that he decided to move back there again. And the same night he moved back, God appeared to him and reconfirmed the promises that he had made to Abraham. If Isaac had not had those hassles, he probably would have stayed in Gerar. But God used those hassles to move him back to where he was supposed to be. And when Isaac finally moved back to the town where Abraham had lived, the Lord blessed him. If any of us have been wandering from the Lord, come back to the place of obedience, and God will bless you and confirm his promises to you. Our second ordinary, extraordinary person number 2 in light of this being the 4th of July almost, is a founding father, Samuel Adams. Now, who was Samuel Adams? Would we even recognize his name if he wasn't the name and face of an extremely delicious beverage? Probably not. And much like Isaac, Samuel Adams was an ordinary man with ordinary trials and fears, sins and hassles. Sam was born in Boston to what we would probably consider now to be upper middle class parents. His father was a malter, and they had one of those things, but he made the malt and he owned the brewery. He was also a devout Puritan and a local politician. So because of his Puritan upbringing, Sam had values instilled in him that fair was important. Being fair and being treated fairly. Sam had an ordinary childhood, as you would expect of a child of some privilege. He graduated from primary school and he applied to Harvard University where he wanted to study law. But turns out his grades weren't quite good enough for Harvard University School of Law. So he just kind of became an undergraduate at Harvard University. He graduated with a regular degree. And then he drifted, job to job. He took out loans from his father, which he mostly just frittered away. He got fired from every job he'd ever had. He was fired from positions at a newspaper. He was going to be worked at an accounting firm. He had no head for that. They fired him. And many other jobs. Everything that he did, he got fired from. He never held a steady job until he was 34 years old. And that's when he was elected tax collector for Boston. Now, not surprisingly, he wasn't very good at that either. And he got fired for not collecting the proper amount of taxes because he was instilled with this Puritan value of fairness. They can't pay, so I'm not going to take their money. Government didn't care for that type of attitude from their employee. So they fired him. Eventually, Sam did marry the daughter of his pastor, and he fathered 6 children, 4 of whom died in infancy. And sadly, his wife also died, giving birth to their last child. So here he is. He's 42 years old. He's a widower with 2 children, no income, no real prospects, and lots of burnt bridges in his past. Eventually, his father got him a menial general labor job with a newspaper outside of Boston in Massachusetts. And it was here that he started to get into politics and fight for independence from Great Britain. After his workday of loading boxes and trucks and whatever else they had, he would stay and anonymously write editorials extremely critical of the government of England and how their taxes on the colonies weren't fair. And his goal was to unite those colonies, all 13 colonies, with one voice so they could stand up to England. Now he had a job and a mission. And he eventually remarried, but he hadn't changed too much. He was still very much single-minded in the beginning of the Revolution and spent much of the 1760s away from home, putting his estate, his reputation, and his family's lives at risk by not being there. But like Isaac, he obeyed God and came back to Boston. In 1765, he was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives, the colonial House of Representatives, still governed by England. where he defended the rights and liberties of the people who elected him. However, the royal governor was dissatisfied with the direction that the House of Representatives was going, so he dissolved the legislature in 1768 and sent for a force of the king's army to come to Boston as peacekeepers, which led to the Boston Tea Party, which Sam planned and helped to carry out. And the Boston Tea Party was the first salvo fired in what would become the American Revolutionary War, which led to our independence as a nation. Sam Adams was not a great orator. He had a quavering voice and shaky hands, so he let others make speeches, while he wrote provocative articles and pulled political strings behind the scenes. He was an ordinary man who obeyed God and was able to do extraordinary things. Sam, the one with the grades not good enough to get into Harvard Law School, the one had been fired from every job that he'd ever had, was elected as a delegate from Massachusetts to the First and Second Continental Congress. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and he served 3 terms as governor of Massachusetts. Thomas Jefferson said of him, "He was truly the man of the Revolution." And our third ordinary, extraordinary person are the people of Cornerstone Christian Church. Because not only are we celebrating the 249th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but we're also celebrating the 3rd anniversary of the founding of Cornerstone Christian. On July 1st, 2022, we were officially disaffiliated with the Methodist Church, and we became our own independent church. God brought Isaac back home to Beersheba to continue the promise that he had made with his father Abraham. God used Samuel Adams to help found and establish one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all. But were they perfect people? No. They were just ordinary people with ordinary trials, fears, sins, hassles, and family problems. But these ordinary people obeyed God and were used to accomplish extraordinary things in God's name. So it was with the people of Cornerstone Christian. We were all just ordinary people, and everyone came together and used their own unique abilities to achieve more than anyone could have done alone. Did we have trials, fears, and hassles? Absolutely. But is this anniversary of things that a few people did in 2022? No. The many wonderful people that have joined our group since then have taken just as big a leap, perhaps a bigger leap, than those of us that were here before. Everyone that has ever been involved, however ordinary they feel their involvement was, have used their skills and gifts to mold Cornerstone Christian into what God would have it to be, and it continues to this very day. Now, how does all this tie into my bat? Last Monday, one of our employees was transferring our totes from our daily order from the front part of the store into the pharmacy, and then I heard a scream. I thought it was a banana peel, I heard from my office. And sure enough, right there on the carpet, laying right next to my desk, was a completely motionless bat, just laying there. Maybe he's dead, said Missy. I knew better. So those of you that know me at all know that I have a completely irrational, unnecessary fear of bats. I freely admit that. And I've had that fear my whole life. Like most children, I suppose, you're all afraid of snakes and spiders and mice and bats, but you can yell for your dad to come and take care of it for you. That's kind of my plan now, still. My dad's been gone for a long time. A couple of weeks, I'm going to turn 60. And I've gotten over my fear of spiders and snakes and mice and all sorts of other things. But I still can't do anything with bats. And I've explained it to people. It's not that I know I can, I'll just toughen up. I can't. My blood pressure rises. My chest tightens up. And like Isaac, I panic. And I'm paralyzed with fear. In most aspects of my life, I'm kind of an introvert. But when there's a bat in the house or the store, I will run down the middle of the street screaming like a little girl for somebody, anybody, to come help me. Craig has saved my life more times than any of us can count by taking care of my bats. But sometimes Craig isn't there. So, in the last, and this is just off the top of my head when I was writing this down, I've had 3 of my neighbors at various times, my son-in-law, my nephew, an antique guy that had an antique shop in Osmond, a retired elderly teacher, a retired veterinarian, several employees, a couple of their husbands, Jen, and other members of this church. And once I even had a patient. He called and he said, "Hey, I'm a patient from Pearson." He said, I didn't, I'm out of my blood pressure medicine. I forgot to reorder it. I'm coming up to get it. We said, "Okay, we'll get it ready for you." Just about that time, a bat comes from under the counter in the pharmacy. Not the pharmacy, but the pharmacy, the little square that I stand in 50 hours a week. My little safe place. There was a bat there. So I only had one choice. I ran to the front door. And I stood by the front door. In case he came that way, I was headed outside. And I don't know how long we stood there, but probably about 15 minutes, because next thing I know, Dennis pulls up. And he walks in and he goes, "What are you doing standing up here?" I said, "Well, there's a bat in the back. So if there's a bat in the back, I'm in the front." And he said, "Are my blood pressure pills ready?" And I said, "Dennis, there's a bat in the back." And he said, "So I can't get my blood pressure pills unless the bat leaves?" "Pretty much, yeah. Because I'm not going back there until he's gone." And so this crippled up man, and I don't feel a bit guilty about this. That's the sad part. But this crippled up older man walks back, shaking his head the whole time, I'm sure. Walks back with his bare hand. He knocks it out of the air, stomps on it with his boot, picks it up, carries it past me, and stares at me the whole time he's carrying it past me, and throws it out in the middle of the street. And then he comes back in and he said, "Now can I have my blood pressure pills?" Absolutely. On the house. Anyway, I hate bats. Hate them. They have no redeeming qualities. There's no value to having bats. And I don't want to hear that they eat mosquitoes. Who cares? I still get bit by mosquitoes. So they're not doing a very good job. They're not very efficient. They are the leading vector for rabies. Since 2006, 2% of brown bats in Nebraska, 2% is huge, have tested positive for rabies. Do you know what the life expectancy after you start to show symptoms of rabies is? None. And yet they're protected? Come on. So anyway, I got a bat laying right there next to my desk. And I realized for the first time in 60 years that a bat laying on the carpet is not nearly as scary as a bat swooping around in the air. Due to the anatomy of a bat, they can't take flight from the ground. They have to have some air under them first. So that's why they typically sleep high up, upside down. They just let go of their feet and away they go. But from the carpet by my desk, I realized that there was no danger in that bat taking off. So even me was able to put a bucket over the top of him because we were busy. I needed to do something besides think about this bat. I put a bucket over the top of him to at least contain him. Now at this point I should probably point out that breaking into my house or pharmacy is a capital offense. So as such, he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in the gas chamber, where he died a much more peaceful death than I had first imagined for him. But like that bat, we ordinary Christians seem to only be able to fly or to step out in faith if certain conditions are met. We make it a daily habit to believe something only after we have received sufficient information to determine the likelihood of a positive outcome. Is it going to work? If not, I'm not going to do that. However, also like the bat, when we are flying, when we've stepped out in faith and we're gracefully gliding, we are awesome. But we don't live in a world where our faith can be activated just once in a while or sporadically. We can't know the outcome will be positive before we start. And if we have to be thrown into the air or pushed off a cliff or something before we are activated, our faith, we are a target for Satan. Satan uses that indecision to cause trials, hassles, and fears. Now, I still hate bats, but they're much easier to deal with when they're grounded on the carpet. And I know that now. Although I very seldom have one that's just grounded on the carpet. And they're much easier for me to stay in the same room with if they're not going anywhere. And I'm sure that Satan prefers us ordinary Christian people to be grounded on the carpet, where he knows where we are and that we're not going anywhere. Because if we're out flying around, he has trouble stopping us. Just like Abraham, Isaac, Sam Adams, and the people of the Cornerstone Christian Church. See, I tied it all together. So today, in conclusion, as we celebrate Independence Day and our independence, we remember the ordinary, extraordinary people who got us to this point. We need to realize that God has blessed us not just so that we will be blessed, but so that we can become a blessing to others. He wants us, ordinary as we are, to be able to be the instrument for taking the message of Jesus Christ to all nations. So, to Pastor Josh and everyone here today, everyone watching online, anyone who has ever filled this pulpit or those pews in the last 4 years, I thank you and applaud you. God bless you. God bless the United States of America, and God bless Cornerstone Christian Church. Amen.